Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Tighe. I am the Executive Manager for Primary Care Development at the Nepean Blue Mountains PHN, and we would like to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Primary Healthcare Providers and Disaster Management. We're actually really excited about this webinar and hope that you will find it informative and also provide you with some tools that will assist you for your own practice, but also for the work that you're doing with your patients as well. So as this is a webinar, all participants will actually be on mute throughout the webinar and it is being recorded. All question and answers will be facilitated through the Zoom Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. So please put the questions into the Q&A box and we will manage those, and not in the chat if that's possible, please. There will be a designated Q&A time at the end of the session and we will then go through those questions then. We also want to note that this subject may trigger memories of past incidents, and assistance is available on our Head to Health phone line, which is 1-800-595-212, Monday to Friday between 8:30 and 5 p.m. as well. So before we get started though, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land. I am currently on Durug land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any Aboriginal people who have joined us in this webinar this evening. So to get started, I'm just going to first of all go through the agenda for this evening. So we have some great speakers who have been willing to give up their time this evening to share their expertise in relation to this topic. Our first speaker this evening is Mim Gardner. We then have Dr. Anoka from North Richmond, Mary Harrington from My Health North Richmond, Hugh McDowell from the Bureau of Meteorology, Maddie from the Community Outreach Program Manager of Infrastructure New South Wales, Dr. Louise McDonald from Health Pathways, and Mari Rosny, our Disaster Planning Coordinator. So I'm just going to introduce you to our first speaker and then we'll get on with the evening. So Mim Gardner is a Community Capability Officer with the New South Wales State Emergency Service. She has over 35 years experience in emergency management as a volunteer and now works with the SES on the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley Flood Risk Management Strategy with Infrastructure New South Wales. So thank you, Mim. I'm going to hand over to you and we look forward to hearing from you this evening.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'd also like to acknowledge the Dharawal people, who the lands I'm on currently, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people of the First Australians, whose lands, winds and waters and skies we now all share, and pay respects to their unique values and then continuing enduring cultures and deepen and enrich our lives and our natures and community. Firstly, next slide, thanks. Firstly, I'd like to talk about patient X. Patient X knew they had to evacuate in the morning before the SES put out an evacuation order, as they had a specialist medical appointment. They packed their bags, but the floodwaters had already cut them off. Luckily, they made the right decision to stay out of the floodwaters and call for help. New South Wales Health contacted the local emergency management officer, the local emergency management controller, and others at the Windsor Emergency Operations Centre to investigate the best way forward. They then contacted the local emergency SES commander, who drove out to see how they were going to get patient X out. Due to high waters, a boat was required. It was now dark and still raining. The boat they had ordered had to go and be prioritised via the Incident Operations Centre of the flood desk. Accommodation had to be arranged. The local health representative from the functional area had to drive out and meet patient X and transport them back to the accommodation so they could attend their appointment the next morning. Patient X stayed in the accommodation until the water levels receded and it was safe to return. This was no one's fault. Patient X, in fact, was proactive, but unfortunately, there was a faulty gauge which added the complexity to the situation. But this is an example that gives us something to think about. It demonstrates the need not only for self-situational awareness, but the amount of resources it took just to move one person, and gives us something to think about what happens in a larger flood when these resources may not be available and what alternate measures would be required. Next slide, thanks. Over the last couple of years, we've had several floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean. Today, I'm going to give you some bit of information and I guess some things to think about. This is the particular flood that happened in July this year. Like many other floods, it started with an east coast low, a whole lot of rain and saturation of soil. Dams were full. We had roads closed for about 6 to 7 days. We had the bridges closed. We had the ferries out. Like many Hawkesbury Nepean floods, we were busy with other floods happening in Sydney too. And with any decent amount of rain, we got flash flooding across many parts of Sydney. This is particularly dangerous. As you can understand, with your clients, we need to particularly be aware of flash flooding. This can happen anywhere. And what we'd like you, I guess, to think about is if that, I guess, conversation comes up or you hear your clients talking about flash flooding and you hear the Bureau of Meteorology mention flash flooding, this is a trigger to stay at home. Stay at home and avoid driving. Flash flooding can catch people unaware very quickly as the water rises very quickly. Next slide, thanks. Communities are often isolated, not only due to road closures, rising floodwaters, but also due to landslips. It is important to think about this for your business. Will it be affected by isolation? What does this look like for you and your staff and your clients? Are you able to keep operating if isolated? What additional resources would you need to do this? Is there something you can do to minimise the disruption to service your community? Is this your business? Is it in a flood area? Do you know what area you're in? If you don't know, you can go to the New South Wales State Emergency Service page and you can actually have a look at what level your area is impacted by flood. Have a look at a website, check that out. What will you do if your staff or you receive an emergency warning to evacuate? We've had many requests for assistance and some people have had to wait due to congestion. But more importantly, we know that during large floods and even small ones, the telecommunications are compromised. Water, sewage and power is also cut in some areas. These utilities progressively get worse as the flood levels rise. For this reason, we only publish evacuation centres at the time of the event to ensure none will be compromised by floodwaters. So it's important that if people have friends and family, this is a far better place to go to. Next slide, thanks. As you can see from this slide, there are many emergency services and other organisations involved in flood response. The New South Wales SES is the combat authority for flood, storms and tsunamis. During a flood event, the functional areas are engaged. One of these areas is health, and this is where the PHN connects into this event. If you have any questions in an event, you can reach out to your local SES to seek clarifications or use your normal channels into the PHN. Your business premises may not even be directly impacted by your flood, but are your staff impacted or are your patients impacted? Think about what happens if you lose your staff. How many can you lose before your business does not operate? It's important to know what your plan looks like. Is your plan robust? Do you rehearse it? Do you review it after each event? Next slide, thanks. We know people still think it's okay to drive through floodwaters. You wouldn't drive through a fire, so why would you drive through floodwaters? And I think it's because people still think it's fine and it's not dangerous. There is something we need your help with, and that is to help change attitudes, or more importantly, help change people's behaviour. We need to talk about the positive behaviour, like if it's flooded, forget it. Turn around, find another way. Why? Because it doesn't matter how deep that water is, you never know what that road surface is like underneath. Quite often we have road damage, and then that's when cars get washed away, or the debris in that water will wash cars away. So really, it's never safe to travel in waters, even if it looks shallow. So that is the one message, that if you hear someone talking about it, we'd love you to help, I guess, get that message across. Next slide, thanks. In the last few floods, it's been devastating for those affected. But one of the concerning things we've heard is that people are referring to that these are huge floods that they've had. What we need people to realise is whilst it's been devastating for those affected, these have been quite small floods. And we need, I guess, you to understand that a flood can happen at any time, at any height, and every flood is different. Next slide, thanks. The other thing I'd like to, I guess, leave you with is the last two slides, and that is we have a new Australian warning system. We've partnered with the Department of Customs Service to develop a multi-hazard warning platform called Hazard Watch. This is now on our website. You can now see the different warnings and you can see a map of them. Hazard Watch came out on the 30th of September, and it's an Australian warning system across Australia. So what that is 3 different currently triangles, which gives you the warning section. And you're probably used to this because you've seen it in bushfires. You have advice, watch and act, and emergency warnings. But more importantly, we have 2 volunteers, Michael and Lacey, that on the next slide will be able to explain that for you. Thanks very much. Next slide, thanks, if we could play that.
Our warning system is changing. I'm Lacey, and in this video, Michael and I will be taking you through those changes.
Our new warnings align to the Australian warning system, which has 3 levels. You will see these 3 coloured icons in all of our warning products during floods. These are also the icons for storms and tsunamis. Other agencies across Australia will also use similar icons for other hazards like bushfires and cyclones.
Where you may have previously seen warnings like minor flood bulletin, major flood bulletin, or evacuation warning, these will now be simplified into these 3 warning levels.
For each warning, the New South Wales SES will provide details about the hazard and where it is occurring, an action statement to advise you what you should do when the warning is received, and the warning level indicating the severity of the hazard.
As the rain starts to fall and floodwaters rise, the New South Wales SES will issue warnings based on the level of risk and expected consequence to the community.
If we receive information from the Bureau of Meteorology that minor flooding is expected or a flood watch is issued, we may issue an advice level warning. If floodwaters are expected to be moderate or major, we may issue a watch and act warning. If a community is likely to be significantly impacted by these floodwaters and we need to evacuate people, we will issue an emergency warning.
Our new warnings framework provides greater flexibility, so we can issue warnings separate to the Bureau of Meteorology depending on the expected consequence. Follow the actions in the warning, which may include stay informed, prepare to evacuate, or move to higher ground.
For more information, visit the New South Wales SES website at ses.nsw.gov.au.
Thank you very much, Mim. So our next 2 speakers, unfortunately, were unable to be with us tonight, but they have pre-recorded their message. And our first one is Dr. Anoka. Dr. Anoka has been a GP in the Hawkesbury region since 2015. You may have actually seen Dr. Anoka during the July floods when A Current Affair interviewed her on her amazing work that she had done assisting the community in North Richmond when they were unable to access GPs during the floods. Our other speaker is Maddie Harrington. Maddie has been working in general practice since she was 16. She's taken over the role recently of practice manager earlier this year and has worked through the recent 4 floods and affected by patients and communities in the Hawkesbury region at North Richmond My Health. So we're just going to play their recordings now.
I have a solo GP practice with 1 nurse, 2 receptionists, and we're on this side of the North Richmond Bridge, so I've been through a couple of floods this year. See, with my experience, practice can take a few steps to prepare for a disaster. it is important that some of the staff are on this side of the bridge so we can still keep it going. So in my practice, I'm the only one who's on the other side of the bridge, on the Richmond side. So I have 2 receptionists and the nurse and the physiotherapist. Like, we all have Zoom since COVID. We've all gone through Zoom and we got used to Zoom. But most of the elderly people in my practice are not very computer savvy. So to overcome that, I have a secondary phone number on my mobile. So if people don't want to do Zoom, they can ring me on my mobile number, which is a separate to my private numbers. And also, I have already have agreements with most of the pharmacies that my patients go to. They can always ring me if they come without a script during a disaster, and they're happy to provide them with the scripts. And then they keep a list and they get me the list later on so I can provide them with the appropriate scripts. And even if people get evacuated to a different area, if they have to go to their relatives or to an unknown area, I always tell people to, if anything like that happens, go to their nearest chemist, and then they can contact me through my phone. So the other thing is, we always make sure we have emergency medications like extra Ventalines and all that, in case people can't get to the pharmacy, or if they come with a acute asthma attack. My nurse is quite experienced. She's got a lot of emergency experience. So we have everything in stock in case people have no access to a pharmacy or anything. We have extra antibiotics. So we are well stocked in tetanus injections, all immunizations, and most of the emergency medications. In my practice, it's only me. The rest are all on this side. So I actually have not missed a single flood. I managed to come with SES. So if I missed it just a day or like one day, I somehow managed to come. But we are all set up. Like the receptionist always comes in on time, and the phone's running as normal. So the nurse and the receptionist usually quickly triage patients and see who really needs to go on, if I'm not here, who needs to go on telehealth. If they don't want to do Zoom, they can put them through to my phone. If I'm not here, like for little dressings or wounds or anything, the nurse can do most of the stuff. Because we have no pathology, we have no access to pathology, we have no access to x-rays. So people can't go and get those things done. So we have plasters that we think, if we think it is a fracture, then we treat it as a fracture until we can get x-ray. If they can't get to Zoom, like people have sent me pictures of their injuries. So I can advise the nurses what to do. And most of the ambulance officers knows me too. So if they go to a place and if they think that the patient can be managed at home, I am more than happy for them to ring me, and then I can advise them whether I'm happy for them to treat them at home and get them to the surgery the next day, or whether it is necessary for them to transport them to the hospital. We've gone through this many times, like the patients discuss with me like what they've gone through, and my opinion on this is like we should get together, or someone should try and make a list of doctors on this side of the river. There's lots of doctors who are not GPs like that I work with at the hospital. They're surgeons, they're like eye specialists, they're gynecologists, they're quite happy to help people during a disaster. So if you can make a list of doctors who are on this side and a list of the doctors who are on the other side who are willing to come in, and then we can make a roster for the doctors. And then the other thing is, if you can have a little medical center, or like I know during one of the floods, we had a little emergency center set up at St. John of God Hospital in Richmond. So there are heaps of nurses on this side that I know of, emergency nurses, midwives, and lots of other general medical nurses who are willing to go to that emergency place and work with the doctors who are available and just run a little hospital or little emergency service so people don't have to worry. I think, given that we've had a few floods happening, if we have a system like that, people are not going to panic. We can all communicate to patients beforehand. Okay, we are getting a system organized. This is where you go, and then you'll be taken care of. Because it's been a lot of problems. People have gone to the hospital by ambulance and then they can't come back. There's no way of getting back. I don't know whether this is feasible. If we can organize a bus or some way of people being transported to like non-emergency patients to a hospital from this side, like to the closest hospital. So people don't have to worry about driving in the rain or driving with a sick person in the vehicle or waiting for an ambulance or like worrying about getting back home after they've been sorted out in the hospital. So they're the few things I think that comes to my mind, and like I've discussed with patients, other doctors, and thought would be nice if we can have like something like that in place. Like the scripts and everything else, like I think even if you're not on site these days, there are e-scripts, there's like, and most of the pharmacies are very kind. They're happy to provide people medications without scripts, and because they're regular patients, even if they're not regular patients, like everyone gets together in a situation like this and try and help the patient. So I think with my experience, I think the most important thing if you're on site is the reassurance to the patient, especially the little kids. Like they're worried that if something happens, like abdominal pain, like if I lay my hands and say, don't worry, don't have to go to the hospital, we can watch. That's the most important thing for them. They go home and then they don't have to panic, they can do other things. So it is most important thing is the reassurance, I think. So most important are the PHN and the SES as the external support. SES is my lifeline. Like they always bring me across the river. So like I've come with them that many times. First thing they do is they ring me and ask me, Dr. Anoka, are you going to go to your practice? So they're always there. They bring me here and they take me back. So they're very important to me. And the PHNs like have offered me nursing staff if I need any nurses. So, and if I need to get any medications across, they've offered me help. So I think they're the most important if you think about external help. And like, I think ambulance staff, everyone helps when it comes to a situation like that. The pharmacy in North Richmond's quite helpful. If people go to the pharmacy and if they can't get to their doctors, they know that I can be contactable, so they contact me even if they're not my patients. We somehow manage to treat them, and my nurse or I advise them what to do. So when the other doctors, like sometimes people say I can't get to that surgery because they're so full. But if I ring and ask them, can you please see a little child who I think is sick, they've always like helped me out and seen the patients to reassure the parents. So it is like a teamwork when it comes to a disaster. We all get together and somehow get through.
Hi, my name is Maddie. I am the practice manager at My Health in North Richmond. I took over the role in February of this year, and my role is to ensure the daily runnings of the practice, looking after GPs, nursing, reception and allied health staff. The steps a practice could take to prepare for a disaster would be organising things such as team viewer accounts for off-site doctors to remote in and help the on-site doctors take some of their load off with telehealth or things like that. They are able to access e-prescriptions, and with our My Practice app that's integrated within My Health, we are able to upload referrals and things such as that so the practice can access them on the app no matter where they are. It could also ensure that their treatment room levels are stocked with a lot of dressings or things that may present. We found it's better to have a lot more things than necessary than to be cut short. But yeah, definitely making sure treatment rooms are stocked and those team viewer accounts are set up. It's a tremendous help. Yeah, so the staff members that aren't able to make it onto our side of the bridge often help out by, again, doing telehealth. They take a lot of the repeat prescriptions, referrals, things that can be done, over the phone, whereas our doctors on site are reserved for things such as emergencies where they walk in and there's dressings or wounds that need to be taken care of, things such as that as well. On site, we provide a lot of the physical care, things such as dressings, wound reviews, a lot of mental health consultations as well, whereas the telehealth ones, like I said before, would be used for repeat prescriptions, referrals, things that can be done without coming into the practice to save those spots or the on-site GPs for more emergent things that may appear. Would be checking in with staff members at the end of the day or intermittently throughout the day to make sure they are doing okay. It is a lot of pressure sometimes to have all those people coming in. I think just sitting down and checking in with them after long days, just making sure they've got the support, even offering time off it if they would like it at the end of the disaster has also been helpful. I know for myself especially. Things such as that, just to make them feel safe and supported with what they do. Of course, in our 4 most recent floods, we have lent on the PHN. Our GP support officer had been incredible, checking in with us almost every day, making sure if there was anything they could do, we were aware of, and we could really rely on them, as well as the disaster coordinator as well. And we also relied heavily on the SES for, updates on the water levels and the safety of the bridges, as well as them asking if we needed supplies or staff members ferried across the bridges as well.
Thank you very much for Dr. Anoka and also for Maddie for sharing that experience. And it really demonstrates the importance of preparation, but also those key roles that primary healthcare providers can play in a disaster. So I'd just like to now introduce Maddie. Maddie has worked in community and stakeholder engagement for over 25 years. She works in the Community Resilience Unit that is focused on building awareness, preparedness and resilience to floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley. So Madeline is going to share what is important in relation to this resilience from Infrastructure New South Wales. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Kate. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from Darug and Gundungurra land in the Blue Mountains. So as Kate said, I'm Madeline. I work for the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley Flood Risk Management Directorate, and I manage the community outreach program. That's part of what's brought me into the ambit of working with the Primary Health Network. Next slide. Thank you. So I want to start by talking about obviously the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley and the reason we're focused on this and why there's such significant cross-government focus on the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley is it has the highest unmitigated flood risk in New South Wales, if not Australia. Next slide, please. So we're going to share a video with you that we created to explain to the community what's called the bathtub effect, and it's why the level of flooding risk in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley is so high. If you could play the video, thanks.
Most major floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley begin with high rainfall during east coast lows. But why are floods here so large and deep? What makes this valley have one of the highest flood dangers in all Australia? 5 major tributaries act like taps, pouring water into the valley during a flood. While every flood is different, the Warragamba River contributed up to 70% of the water in major floods that happened in the past 60 years. The other tributaries typically make smaller contributions. All this water needs to get to the sea, but natural choke points, where the river narrows, slows the flow in this valley. We call this the bathtub effect, where water backs up and starts filling the floodplain because there is only one plug hole letting water out. Because water is confined in this small valley at Wallacia, the worst flood here reached depths around 20 metres above normal river levels. Further downstream, the floodplain at Penrith and Emu Plains is created by the next choke point. Because Penrith has naturally high riverbanks which hold the river back, low-lying areas around Emu Plains and Peachtree Creek are affected first. However, extreme floods in the past have reached as far east as Woodruff Street in Penrith, where the river was 12 metres above normal levels. Further downstream, the next choke point is caused by a series of gorges starting at Sackville. Because the Richmond-Windsor floodplain is relatively flat and wide, floodwaters spread quickly across a vast area. In the worst flood on record, here the river reached 19 metres above its normal level. Floodwaters back up into creeks in the valley and flood islands form as floodwaters rise. It's this bathtub effect that makes floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean so devastating. This is why it's important to respond when you're told to evacuate. The last major flood was in 1990. It will flood again in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley. The risk is real. Do you know your flood risk?
Thanks. Next slide. So now I want to expand a little on some of those issues that add to the complexity and the risk factors that make the Hawkesbury Nepean so dangerous. So first, I just want to look quickly at the hazard. As we've touched on, there's really short lead times often for flooding in our floodplain, and probably Q will touch on this as the Bureau of Meteorology, but we're often the weather pattern is an east coast low that brings flooding, and this doesn't have a long lead time. As you saw in the video, there's this bathtub effect. 5 river systems are all flowing, all that water's flowing into one floodplain, which is ours. You saw the extent of the flooding. So we're talking about 4 key LGAs, Blacktown Hills, Penrith and Hawkesbury. You saw in the video as well, we have very significant flooding depths. So these are unusually high flooding depths. So they're unlike other floodplains. So you saw we can have even 19 or 20 metres above normal river heights. And as Mim touched on, often there can be floods in other parts of Sydney when Hawkesbury Nepean is experiencing a flood. So we could often have flooding in Parramatta River, the Georges River, and there could be many floods happening across the East Coast. So this is, a part of the picture as well. There's a secondary issue around our infrastructure constraints. As many of you would know who live across the Hawkesbury Nepean, we've got a constrained road network. There's many pockets with quite poor public transport. We've got large amounts of geographic isolations, particularly in some LGAs like Hills and Hawkesbury, areas of poor telecommunications, even areas with black spots, and long distances to travel for people, in a normal circumstance, but think about the distances people might need to travel to be away from that flood threat in a flood emergency. There's also demographic issues. We've got a large population, just over 150,000 people that live and work in the full extent of what could be flooded area. A third of the people by recent studies who have lived in the area less than 5 years. We've got significant culturally and linguistically diverse communities, particularly in some of those LGAs like Blacktown and the Hills. There's sections of significant economic stress and large amounts of social isolation and significant social housing. And then the last piece is around the human behaviour part. So what we've seen from a lot of the research that we've done that's driving our work is low levels still of accurate flood risk perception. So people now are probably more aware that they have a flood risk, but we still feel like that sense of accurate flood perception of the height of possible flooding, we still feel that that hasn't really landed for a lot of people. Low levels of active individual preparation, low levels of business and organisation having the right continuity plans in place. And what we've seen from some very recent research we've done is there's still a lot of resistance to evacuating. There's an anchoring bias, which is that people will put a lot of weight on what they've actually seen with their own eyes and what they've personally experienced in their area. So that's hard to then have them think about the floods that you've seen in the Hawkesbury Nepean are around 1 in 20 chance per year events. And so a 1 in 100 chance per year or larger than that is hard for people to envisage. And the other thing we've seen is safety in numbers behaviour. And in this case, unsafe behaviour, but people following each other. So a lot of people doing what their neighbours are doing and other people in their street and choosing not to leave even when they've been asked to evacuate. Next slide, please. So just to round that off, the last thing I want to talk about is that floods in the valley are dangerous due to their range of impacts. And Mim touched on a few of these from the March and July floods. If people don't leave early enough, their evacuation routes in many cases can get cut and people can end up trapped on flood islands. In our across our LGAs, roads, bridges, ferries and rail lines will close. Roads can become dangerous as floodwater rises and rescuing people becomes dangerous, difficult and in some cases impossible because it's too dangerous for SES to be out in the boats. And this other piece that we're working really hard on is that many people will be affected by flooding even if floodwater doesn't reach their homes. So many people have said, well, I'm on a high piece of land in McGrath Hill or whichever suburb they're in, but many people don't realise you don't actually need floodwater in your home to be directly impacted by flooding. So in the case of significant floods, people could be many days, weeks or even months without power, water, sewerage and telecommunications. Next slide. So our program where we're working with the New South Wales SES is focused on how we build community resilience to flooding. And that's around how do we have a community that's flood aware? How do we have a community that's prepared for floods? And then how do we have a community that responds in the way we need when a flood incident is active? Next slide. So what are we looking for if we have a community that's aware of flood risks? So the key things for us is we need a community that understands the nature of flooding in the Hawkesbury Nepean, that accepts the severity and the potential risk to life of the floods we can have, knows that no flood is the same. So just because the one you saw, in July looked like this, it doesn't mean the next flood will look like that. That people are aware that there's no window for floods to happen, like with bushfires, they can happen at any time of the year. And a community that's flood aware in the way we'd like them to be takes that level of flood risk seriously. So I want to just quickly show you a couple of images. There's a lot of resources we've built to help tell the story of Hawkesbury Nepean floods. So as Mim spoke about, the image on the right shows you a snapshot from the website. You can actually put in your suburb. So I can put in South Windsor or Bligh Park or Riverstone, and I can have a look at what my flood risk looks like in a small, medium and large scale event. And you can see a copy of that Riverstone one there. So there's one for that for every suburb in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, and it tells you about past floods in that area as well as heights of flooding, and also gives you some preparedness tools. So that's a key thing for us around people knowing their risk. Next slide. So the second part is, if people are aware of their risk, that's not enough. We need people to then take those preparedness steps. So what's a prepared community look like? So it's a community that's planned with their household. They have a get ready to go kit. They know where they'll go if they need to evacuate. And in many cases, that would be family and friends. And they also know their evacuation routes. They're familiar with those. So up there are a series of links, and I know this presentation is going to be shared with people. There's a whole range of resources we now have on the New South Wales SES website, some of them specific to Hawkesbury Nepean, around helping you get a plan together. So some of those links that are there, but I'll just share the next, if we share the next slide. We've developed a 2-page get prepared fact sheet that basically has key tasks that people can do before a flood, and key things that people could just refer to at the last minute in a flood event. And the idea with this is a sort of checklist where people could actually tick off tasks they've undertaken, because the real thing about a plan is not that it's on a piece of paper and you've tucked it away somewhere. It's actually the quality of conversations you've had with your family, with your GP, with family where you might be able to relocate, with the people who might be able to help you adjust your animals or look after your pets. So it's really about the quality of the conversations we have. Next slide. And this is just an example of a whole range of fact sheets we've developed to help people better understand their flood risk in the Hawkesbury Nepean, and a number of them are around helping people become familiar with their evacuation routes and also know what to pack in a bag. So there's quite a lot of resources that we're keen to have as many people in the community share with each other to help us all get better prepared. Next slide. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this. We've done a lot of work with the SES to try and improve the quality of in-language resources for those people where English is a second language. So I don't know how many of your clients or patients or people you work with, or even people in your own household, might speak English as a second language or would really like things in their first language. So there's a lot more resources, and we're planning to build a lot more. But you can see we've got a lot of fact sheets in a range of languages, and now a whole lot of new videos and social media tiles to share that message in the key languages that are in the floodplain. Next slide. And just to finish, I want to touch on what does a flood responsive community look like. And so the key things for us are they're a community that follow emergency warnings. So they're literally following those, whether that's on Facebook or on an app or on a website. They're a community that leave when asked. They leave with their animals and their valuables. They evacuate to safety, and they return when it's safe. And I guess a couple of key things we'd really like to speak about, where we see that community champions, community representatives, trusted professionals in a community can really lead the way, is we're seeing a lot of potentially unsafe behaviour where people are choosing to trust their own instincts and what their neighbours are doing, rather than make safe decisions for themselves and their families. So I guess we'll probably explore it a little bit more, but I guess that's some key things we wanted to leave you with, that there are a whole range of resources, and we'd love to partner with you to the degree that you're able to help us get that message out. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Maddie. Some really critical resources there that we'll be able to make use of, and we will have those up on our website, so you can have the links through to those resources. And as Maddie said, the slides will be shared. So I just want to now introduce Hugh. Hugh is a senior climatologist at the Bureau of Meteorology. A key part of his work is to be the source of climate information and brief emergency planners and services that are preparing for and responding to hazards. So Hugh, we're really looking forward to hearing from you this evening. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. So this evening I'm going to give you a seasonal climate brief. This is kind of the information that we would give to the emergency services and emergency services partners preparing for a season to come ahead. And I think this information will be useful for yourselves. And just like to say at the start of this, that all this information, pretty much all of it, can be found externally on our website. If you just Google BOM climate, you'll be able to see most of the images that I'm going to show you this evening, and I'm going to explain some of them. So hopefully when you access the information in the future, it'll be more useful for you. If we go to the next slide, please. So first of all, I'll talk about the recent conditions across New South Wales as a whole, and particularly focusing on the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, and then the climate drivers that are going to be in play for this coming end of spring and into the summer, and then the climate outlook focused on rainfall and temperature for the rest of spring and for the coming summer. Next slide, please. So if we look at these two maps, they are Australia-wide, and all the maps on our website are Australia-wide, but I'll focus in on the area that we're going to talk about. They're both to do with rainfall amounts that we've had so far this season. On the left, the rainfall anomalies from the start of the year until the 27th of October. And then pretty much the last 3 rainfall deciles. We haven't got the October maps in there yet. When I was preparing this presentation, it was around the end of the month, so the October wasn't available yet, but the trend is similar. And we can see on the rainfall anomalies that we've seen more than 800 millimetres of rainfall above the average that we'd see in those purple colours around the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley. And if we look at the rainfall deciles, that shows it's very much above average in that 3-month period, bordering on the highest on record in parts of eastern Australia. So very high rainfall amounts already so far this season. If we move on to the next slide. That's given us very high water storage levels as well. The dams are full, the river systems are full, there's a lot of water in the landscape. And if we move on to the next slide, please. That flows into the soil as well. Soil moisture is up, and we can see the blue scale there shows us that we're above average to very much above average around this part of New South Wales, and particularly the Hawkesbury and Nepean. That's higher than it was in September 21 and September 2020. So we've got higher soil moisture. There's more water in the landscape now than there was at this stage in the last 2 years. If we move to the next slide, please. So that leads us to flooding influences in the coming weeks. Again, that soil moisture is high, and the rainfall anomalies are expected to be fairly high from the next fortnight, really. We could see higher than average rainfall amounts. If we move to the next slide, please. Focusing in on the local area, we can see we really need to change the scale on this map, unfortunately. Everywhere across the Greater Sydney region has had over 1,000 millimetres of rainfall, which is unusual for this point up to the end of October. Focusing in on Richmond, that's a site that's had 133 years of data, and we've got 1,300 millimetres so far this year. It's not a record. The record is 1,700 millimetres in 1950, and that's not a record that anyone wants to break this year, but it is roughly twice the amount of rainfall that you'd expect to see. So we've had a very wet year so far this year. If we move on to the next slide. So that leads us into the climate drivers in the next slide, please. So this is going to explain what we could see for the rest of the spring and into the summer. So we look at the sea surface temperatures around Australia and across the tropical Pacific and also the Indian Ocean as well. And when we see those blue signal in the tropical Pacific and the red warmer than average around northeastern Australia, that is typical of a La Nina pattern. If we move over to the Indian Ocean, again, we can see those reds, those warmer than average sea surface temperatures about northwestern Australia. And then a slight blue signal, the cooler than average temperatures about eastern Africa, and that's typical of a negative Indian Ocean dipole. If we move on to the next slide, please. So the Indian Ocean dipole, we're actually in a negative phase of that at the moment. And what that means is, on this slide, actually, I'll just talk about what the climate models are showing. The climate models are showing is that we're expecting that to end in roughly December. And if we move to the next slide, the negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole means that we see increased warmth and increased convection about northwestern Australia, and we see the circulation set up where we see air flowing from Africa across the Indian Ocean to Australia. We see lifting in the air, more moisture, more heat, and it increases the chance of rainfall across a large part of Australia, but actually eastern Australia as well, and the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley. And the reason for that is as the cold fronts and the troughs come out of the Indian Ocean and out of the Southern Ocean, they tap into that moisture, they pull it down across Australia, and it rains out across New South Wales and the Hawkesbury and Nepean. We get more what we call northwest cloud bands, and therefore more rainfall, an increased chance of rainfall. If we move to the next slide, please. We're also in a La Nina as well, and the climate models show us that we're expected for that La Nina to finish sometime in early 2023. Now that'll be a little bit earlier than we would normally see La Nina finish. The typical pattern is kind of into autumn really, rather than late summer, early autumn. So it'd be prudent just to be aware of that and just prepare that the La Nina conditions may cling on a little bit longer, but we are expecting to return to neutral by early 2023 currently. If we move to the next slide, please. What La Nina means, and unfortunately this is the wrong graphic in here. It should have been updated, apologies for that. But La Nina is very much like the Indian Ocean dipole, but it is in the Pacific Ocean. We see increased rainfall across eastern Australia, and with more easterly winds coming in off the Tasman Sea, that gives us more showers and increased chance of rainfall. If we move to the next slide, please. We also have positive SAM expected to be in place for much of the season. Now, normally the SAM is a climate driver that varies on a weekly timescale or perhaps monthly, but without going into too much detail, there's a stronger than usual polar vortex, which drives a stronger jet stream, which drives stronger westerly winds further south towards Antarctica and allows easterly winds to flow in across New South Wales. Again, that gives us an increased chance of rainfall across New South Wales and the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley. And it won't be positive throughout the whole season, but on average, we're expecting more positive phases of the SAM throughout summer. If we move to the next slide, please. Now, this might have just given the game away a little bit, but we move into the forecast for the rest of spring and into summer. If we move to the next slide. So if we look at these maps here, we've got the temperature maps on the left and the rainfall map on the right. Now, I won't dwell on temperature too much, but broadly in November, we're expecting cooler than average temperatures because of that moisture, because of that extra cloud cover around. But rainfall, we have quite a strong signal across New South Wales and the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley for above average rainfall or increased chance of above average rainfall. And that's due to those climate drivers that are in place. So again, we could see more rainfall than is usual to end this year and into the summer and the start of next year. If we move to the next slide, please. And like I said, that's shown in the November to January signal here. Again, we've got those subdued temperatures, but again, the important thing to focus on is that signal for rainfall. Throughout November to January, we're still seeing that increased chance of rainfall. Now, we are losing the negative Indian Ocean dipole, but La Nina should still be in effect through this period, and the SAM should be broadly positive throughout this period as well. And that's what's contributing to that signal for increased rainfall across the Hawkesbury and Nepean, and particularly New South Wales as well. If we move to the next slide, please. The December to February signal. Now, we start to see an easing in the signal here when we look at rainfall. And I'm going to focus on rainfall really because temperatures aren't as of much of a concern. The signal does seem to be easing. We're still seeing an above average signal for rainfall, but it's not as strong as it was. And that is due to the La Nina expected to be ending, and also the negative Indian Ocean dipole should have ended. So we should interpret this. There's still going to be a chance of flooding. There's still going to be a chance of increased rainfall, but there's likely to be some drier periods in there as well. And it's not, it shouldn't rain all the time. It's not a signal for constant rain. And that's not what we see across Eastern Australia anyway. We see rain coming in events, and that's what Maddie alluded to with those East Coast lows. Rainfall in Eastern Australia particularly comes in short duration bursts, and that leads to flooding as well. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. We can see this for November. Now, we have these graphs here. This is the chance of unusually wet and unusually warm conditions. I'm just going to focus on the unusually wet conditions. Now, we can see here we've got a 2 to 2.5 times chance of seeing unusually wet conditions, and that means the rainfall amounts are likely to fall in that top 20% of the historical range, and that is a good proxy for a risk of flooding. So we can see with this graph, this picture here, that we should be prepared throughout this season for more flooding to occur. If we move to the next slide, please. Now that signal is repeated through November out into the end of January, and just focus on the left-hand picture there. We can still see that roughly 2 times chance of the rainfall falling into that top 20% of the historical range. And you can see these charts on our website as well. They all are there, as I mentioned before. So again, that is a proxy for flooding. We should be prepared. It would be prudent to be prepared for flooding throughout this coming season. If we move to the next slide, please. If we skip this slide, please. And this one as well, please. Now, the final one I want to show you is the streamflow forecasts. And up on the top here, the box and whiskers chart there shows the streamflow for the Richmond, around Richmond. Now, it is showing quite a high chance of increased stream flow, and this is a forecast that's built from all that water in the landscape and the climate outlook, and it shows that we're expecting our rivers, particularly around the Hawkesbury and Nepean, to be in high flow throughout the coming season. If we move to the next slide, please. So this leads us to the severe weather outlook for October out until April 2023. Widespread flooding is more likely across eastern Australia, and that includes the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley. Coastal flooding is also more likely. The severe storm risk is similar. The bushfire risk, and this is the silver lining really to the large cloud that we're talking about, is that it's less likely for parts of the east coast, and that includes the Hawkesbury and Nepean. Heat wave is also less likely. Marine heat waves, it's not that relevant to this, but it's increased risk of that during summer with that increased sea surface temperatures about eastern Australia. Drought and dust are less likely as well. Now, tropical cyclones, yes, they don't really affect this part of New South Wales, but they can move south and redevelop into east coast lows. And an early tropical cyclone is more likely with La Nina as well. So again, that gives us weight to the risk of increased flooding through this coming season. Now, if we move to the last slide, please. So the key message is really that we've seen wetter than average conditions across New South Wales for some time now. They've replenished water storages, but they've led to above normal soil moisture. And actually those water storages can't take much more water in them. A negative Indian Ocean dipole event is underway. It's expected to persist through spring before returning to neutral levels in summer. There's high confidence with this coming back to neutral. La Nina is underway and is expected to continue until early 2023. Now, the climate models show that there is slightly less confidence with it, that it will end that early in 2023, and it would be prudent just to prepare for the La Nina to perhaps continue and linger maybe a little bit longer. But the current thinking is it should end in early 2023. Also, a stronger than average polar vortex is ongoing, and that favours a positive SAM. So again, that's another driver for increased rainfall. So these climate drivers, in addition to a warmer than usual waters surrounding Australia, are resulting in a wetter and cooler than average outlook over the coming months. And those current conditions, that wet landscape, in combination with the wet outlook, are increasing the risk of widespread flooding. However, drought is not expected. If we move on now, please. Thank you. If there's any questions, I can answer those now.
Thanks so much, Hugh. We will leave questions to the end, and we're just going to move now into a little bit of what the PHN has in relation to resources to assist general practices. So first up, I am going to introduce you to Dr. Louise McDonald. Dr. Louise McDonald is our GP clinical lead for Health Pathways, and she's practiced as a GP in the Blue Mountains for over 25 years. So thank you, Louise.
Hi, Louise. We just can't hear you. I think you must still be on mute. If you wouldn't mind unmuting.
I think
Thanks.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Lovely.
So,
thank you.
I'd be interested to know, maybe people can put in the chat if they're familiar with Health Pathways, and I'm hoping most of you are. But if you're not, I'll just start from the beginning. This is the homepage, and really it's a resource for GPs, practice nurses, practice managers can also look at it. It's not directly for patients, but it's for health professionals that can use it. And our PHN can also facilitate you with a password if you haven't got it. So I'm just going to search disasters. So you just put disasters in, and we've done 4 pages on disaster planning, which are there for you. And it's basically these 4 pages. Preparing so there's the preparation, the management during a disaster, and the post-disaster. You can think of it in those 3 ways. So preparing your practice for a disaster, preparing your patients for a disaster, and then what GPs can do during a disaster and post. So I'm just going to very briefly show you them and highlight some things on the pages, and even tonight's information Health Pathways is very fluid, and we can add things and take things away and put new things up. I also just want to point out this button. If you find a link doesn't work or you have a suggestion, you can click on that send feedback and send an email across, and quickly things can change. So it's very responsive. So it's set out, for those who haven't used it before, it's a bit about the background, and then it has, well, this page is about preparing your practice. So each of these little things have a drop-down box, and it's been mentioned a little bit about preparing. This is your own general practice for a disaster. Tonight's all been about floods. These disaster pages are about any disasters: floods, fires, heat waves, power outages. Those kind of things can really affect your practice. So a lot of us don't have a plan, and we probably should. And this page helps you and your practice staff prepare for a disaster. And some of the things have been highlighted today, which is having a way of communicating with your staff. I mean, literally having the list of all your staff's phone numbers and next of kin on either another phone, or certain people in the team have the contacts, so you can talk to your staff if they can't get to work or you don't want them to come into work, etc. The college has put up this emergency response planning tool, which you can use. It's got a yearly fee, but it's with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, and it's very thorough, and it's up on a cloud, so all your data is up there safe, which you can access on, you know, off-site or remotely. So you might want to choose something like that, or you just go through what we've put together and make a plan for your practice. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it really is worth doing, as we've and we've got a couple of scenarios: power outage and bushfire. We haven't got a flood, but quite a lot of information in here if you want to work through it and put something together for your practice. I really encourage you to do it. I'm not sure what's in that one. Oh, there's some more fact sheets from the college. So there's lots of drop downs to find more information. I want to just go back to, whilst we're still on preparation, it's talking to your patients about disasters, and that's been highlighted tonight by the SES, really great talks about preparing your patients so they are ready to be independent, to know what to do when a disaster is happening, and know whether they're going to stay or go, and if they're going to go, how and where and when they're going to go. What we can do as GPs is really encourage them to think through these scenarios, because it's no longer theoretical. This is happening right now, and it will continue to we'll have more disasters with climate change, I personally believe. A lot of people leave the home without their medication, without a phone charger, without a list of what drugs they're on. So you can help them have all that ready. You can upload their medications onto My Health Record, so that if they go to a evacuation centre, another clinician can go and see what medication they're on. So you can do that for them. There's some specific drop downs here about chronic health conditions and what people should be planning of doing with particular conditions, such as diabetes, just an example, really simple things. So helping your patient prepare. And the other one is in the disaster. So often the best thing a GP can do is actually keep their doors open, keep operating. And if you are going to do some extended hours, let the PHN know. As previous speakers have said, the PHN is very good at communicating, but we as GPs can communicate back to the PHN and let them know what we're doing with our hours, or if you have to close up, let the PHN know. There is, our PHN's particularly ahead of other PHNs in having a role for GPs to work in evacuation centres. And if you're interested in that, please let the PHN know, because we do have a roster. We have only about 8 or 10 GPs that are ready to go and work in evacuation centres, but if people are interested, you certainly can be part of that, and the PHN will give you some training. They've also made little kits so that when you go into an evacuation centre, there's very much an order of control, and GPs are not at the top, and we need to work with all the services, and that's part of the training. But if you're interested in working in the evacuation centre, please let the PHN know, or if you know of anyone that is interested. Again, it's pretty straightforward, but have a quick look at that. Again, there's a bit on animals, which was also on the SES page. People need to plan what they're going to do with their animals. That's often a really, last minute thought for some people. I think the flood people are thinking ahead, hopefully, with their animals. Fire, it can happen so quickly, and people need to decide what they're going to do. The final one is post-disaster, which GPs play a very big role in. And there's some very good resources here, particularly, I'll just show you these few down the bottom, helping children and parents who are have children that are very stressed from a disaster. So there's a couple of good links here. Another website down here called Emerging Minds, which is very good. There's also further down a really good thing from the Red Cross. It's actually snuck in here. It might be under this one, patients. Yeah, Red Cross resources. So there's a lot of stuff here that you can look for and give to your patients and use yourself. I really just wanted to show those pages to you, and there's lots we can do to improve our pages. There's a link here to the New South Wales Government financial support. The federal government one's not operating at the moment, and the PHN, or the Health Pathways, knows about that. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight those pages and Health Pathways in itself, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Louise. That was great. And thank you also for mentioning the importance of GPs in the response as well, and the work that we've been doing in relation to that. And as Louise said, if you are interested in being on our register for GPs to respond during a disaster, if we are called upon and required, please contact your general practice support officer, and they'll get you in touch with the right people to talk to about that as well. I'm now going to pass over to Mari. Mari is our disaster planning coordinator. Mari's role involves working with general practices and primary healthcare services to build their capacity to prepare for, respond to and recover from future disasters in our region. So I'm going to hand over to Mari now. She's going to talk about some of the resources that we have as well. Thank you, Mari.
Thanks, Kate. So in terms of general practices and disasters, we know that the medical services are vital in all phases of the disaster and response processes. So preparedness activities can enhance the ability of general practices to deliver care during a disaster, and also to help mitigate the impacts the event will have on a region. So how we assist general practices in disasters is we support them to revise and develop their disaster preparedness plans. We also activate a volunteer surge workforce to assist when general practices can't access their own workplaces. We also provide training through telehealth and technology. We mobilise general practices to take an overflow of patients via telehealth to assist disaster-affected practices. And we facilitate the integration and access to services with other health services, such as pharmacies, pathologies and hospitals, and also to communicate and share information with general practices and associate stakeholders. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of our next steps as a PHN, as disaster management stakeholders, we ensure continuous improvement initiatives are shared across the disaster management sector, and this is to promote the efficiency and efficacy of what we do. So this includes preemptive planning, such as encouraging and attracting more general disaster volunteers to assist when disasters occur. And we've also developed a disaster training toolkit in disaster planning and preparedness for general practices. So this toolkit is free, and it enhances the current training materials for GPs, and it also provides a one-on-one training service for GPs and an ongoing support service also. We also collaborate with the LHD and the PHN board for agreements on development of a shared disaster plan. And we're currently working on the formalising of roles and responsibilities for general practices, pathologies and pharmacies and the LHD in disasters. So we plan to pilot these in the North Richmond area and to scale up then to other areas across the region to respond in any disaster situation. We also continue to advocate for the recognition and formalising of PH roles in future disasters. And we continue to support general practices to develop their capacity to effectively prepare for and respond to disasters. Next slide, thanks. So as Mim and Maddie mentioned earlier, we're actually collaborating with them in terms of providing some resources for general practices that they can provide to communities to assist them in preparing and responding to disasters. And that's generally around disaster preparedness, as Mim and Maddie provided that information, and also mental health resources and access to information for people suffering from mental health due to the disasters. And we will provide general practices with those services once completed. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Murray, and thank you to all of our guest speakers tonight. I'm not sure about you, but I know that I found so many of the talks tonight extremely interesting. We are now at the question and answer period. If anyone has any questions, please post them in the Q&A box. We do have approximately 15 minutes left for some questions and answers. Becky, if you wouldn't mind just taking the slides off the screen, and then we'll put everyone back on the screen as the panel. And I'll bring you all back as a panel. Okay, and if you could turn your screens on, that would be great. Fantastic. Okay. So there's a lot of information in all of that, and we've got a lot of links now, and we also have a number of resources that you've all mentioned. But I guess one of the key questions that I've probably got this evening is, so what's the potential role for primary care providers in this work? How can primary care providers assist you, Maddie, maybe with the work that you've been doing, particularly around building resilience and planning? How's that so important?
I guess we've, Louise touched on it and Mim touched on it, and so did Mari. We really see that the model for the national framework around disaster risk reduction and the state framework is around shared responsibility. So the only way that we'll keep community safe in disaster is if all of us play our part. So we're trying to make sure that we're looking at a whole of government approach. We're partnering with SES because they're the combat agency when we think about disasters such as flood. And I guess the big piece for us is primary healthcare providers are such an interface with the community directly, likely to be very trusted, likely to have respect, likely to have influence. And I guess so for us, it's always felt like this was a really important partnership to start discussing, because oftentimes a community member or resident may need to hear this information from a number of sources to trust that. And I guess we are very aware that general practices and GPs play a very particular role in community, and potentially as a conduit of trusted information. We feel like that's that's something that we'd really like to optimize. And for us, it's not about GPs doing the work of, they're not asked to be emergency service professionals, they're not asked to be flood response, but partly because the health issues get so complicated in a disaster, anything people do to pre-plan makes a massive difference. So this is about reducing the impact on humans in a disaster. So there's that piece. And I do think that the prompts to prepare and take those steps ahead of time, trusted individuals in your life are likely to create that influence. And we know that many of us will need many prompts to take the steps we need to be prepared. So I think doctors, GPs, medical practices, pharmacists are an essential part of that on the ground, and likely to be more influential in some ways than what other experts say. So I'd see that as being a really important link in the network of work we're trying to do on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. So Mim, you talked about the importance of positive messaging and around the around behaviour change as well, and really raising that awareness around the fact that we haven't had the worst flood yet. We think what we've had is bad, and we know it is bad, and it has been really bad, but it's not the worst. And how do we then? What are some ways that we can, as a community, noting that we all have a role here, to really push forward that positive messaging and making sure that we have these conversations that lead to behaviour change?
I think, thank you for that. I think we know, I guess, from research that the more we talk about the negative behaviour, that's what we remember. So if you keep saying do not drive in floodwater, what we know is people remember the drive in floodwater. And it's like any behaviour. If you shame people and things like that, it's not helpful. It also deters people from actually ringing for help if they're shamed about. Look, people drive in floodwater for a range of reasons. Some people choose to do it. Some people panic. We all know, and especially in this medical profession, we all know people act differently under stress. So there's no judgment here. Like, things happen and people do it. But the more we can normalise it, and I think if I can draw you to thinking back for some people around drink driving and how we had that change, or OC health and safety, and how we grew with that, it became everyone's responsibility. So I guess it's about that positive language that we talk about. It's normal to turn around. That's what people are doing. And talk about that positive behaviour and trying to just stay away from the negative, stay away from shaming people around, calling, because you see it on social media. You either get people thinking they're legends or they're abusing the people. So we don't want any of that sort of stuff. We just want to talk about positive behaviour and also raise that risk awareness. So that's probably the biggest message I have, is that if you get stuck, do not hesitate to ring 000. Do not waste time, because those floodwaters are dangerous. Even if it's just at your wheels, you just do not know what that water can do. And you will see our people will go in and they're all dressed up and they're just walking in this much water. And sometimes, look, it may look a bit odd. It may look funny because they're like, what? But that's because there's drains that suck you in. At any time, they could be walking over a drain that will actually suck them in. So there's all these other dangers that people don't realise, and that's why they're all dressed up walking in this much water. So unless you know those things, you don't understand, the reasons behind this so much safety to save people's lives. So it's about just, make the right decision. And the reason, or the best way to make a right decision is to have that planning. So speak to your loved ones. Have the plan known. So, a lot of times people might drive through floodwaters to pick up children. Like, if your child's on the other side and it's a 3-hour trip around, that is going to entice you to do a silly thing. So if you know that your child is safe because you've had a pre-arrangement with the childcare centre that they're going to look after your child and they're safe, then you can make better decisions. So it's about having the arrangements. What if this would happen? What would we do? How would we communicate it? Because as we know, as those waters go up, the mobiles will get jammed. Everyone that will be on them anyway, and you won't be able to get through. So if you can't get through, what is your agreed plan with your family? And if your family's safe, then you're available to help your community. So you can help your clients, you can help your staff, etc.
There's some of those other positive messages, I guess, that we would see community champions, community leaders, trusted people in their community, which I would certainly see medical professionals, people's GPs and practices being part of, is because we're seeing some of those troubling behaviours where people are trusting their own instincts above advice of experts or, information from the Bureau or the New South Wales SES. Our sense is that those community leaders can play a really important part in people saying, oh, I chose not to go last time because I didn't have to worry. Actually, we really want people in those trusted positions at every level saying it's actually really unwise. Like, don't be the person who dissuaded your family from leaving. So we really want people to be modelling and gently challenging and suggesting alternate behaviours, because what we even saw in Lismore was that people trusted what they'd seen before, and many people chose not to follow the advice and then later need to be rescued. Now, mass evacuations and mass rescues, we don't have the resources. That there is no way that everyone will be safe in a mass, in a mass event like that. So the decisions that we make before time, and I think the way to encourage patients and clients and, people in your practices around that is suggesting that anything you've had a conversation about before, anything you've already pre-prepared reduces your stress. Now, most people describe those experiences as highly stressful. So I think what we can focus on is in a natural disaster, there's a lot of elements you don't have control over. We don't have control over the weather. We don't have control over the size of a flood, and particularly the grey area between how big a flood might be between its forecast. So I think really focusing on those elements that people do have control over, and a lot of them are the quality of those discussions. And as I say, I think if we focus on the conversations, the planning, that's what it is. Do you know what I mean? It's not what you write down, it's the conversations and as Louise was pointing out, it's everything from encouraging your patients to upload their records to the My Health, so that basically, as you say, we know lots of people leave home flustered because they haven't even thought about the things they're going to need in 5 hours time, never mind in 5 days time.
And I think, just adding to that, as we know, and this through your business continuity plans, it's almost not even about the end result. It's actually about the journey of planning and knocking out all those things that won't work. So that gives you then the scope of what could work at the end when the emergency comes. At least you know the things that won't work.
Yeah. And I think you've mentioned some really, really great points and areas that primary healthcare providers have potential influence on what in conversations they have with their patients as well, and that can be from the receptionist right the way through to the GP. What about vulnerable population groups? Are there any specific messages that we really kind of need to know for our really most vulnerable in our community?
I mean, that's a big part of why we initially wanted these conversations with the Primary Health Network. Is there's a number of factors that will complicate people's preparedness and evacuation and recovery, and those, when people are already dealing with complex support needs already, we know that those will put people at greater danger and potentially make them more likely to be those people who could be left behind. Like if this is where I think about the Primary Health Network and allied health, but people who are working with someone who lives on their own, like that should be a flag. Do you mean as soon as you know that someone's living on their own, that they're frail and aged, someone's dependent on a lot of medications, they're dependent on help, do you mean that they receive in their own home? To me, it's like, having heard the Bureau, and I think they're doing a great job of really helping people say, look, this is what the weather pattern looks like at the moment. So to me, it's like, you actually do need to carve out a bit of bandwidth, do you know what I mean, to have some of these conversations. And I think we really need to think about the frail and aged, those people who live with a disability, those people who need support to leave, because a lot of the warnings and messages assume that, we're able-bodied, that we have a car, that it's full of petrol, that I've got someone to stay with. And so I think I imagine, and I know Murray and I and Mim have talked about this a lot, for a lot of doctors, they're so busy servicing a client's direct needs, it's hard to think about having a detailed conversation with them about making a plan. But I guess it's important that they're connected in and know that there are resources that actually can assist someone to make a more detailed plan. So, for example, Peppercorn is funded under a project that they're doing in partnership with Sydney Uni for the person-centred emergency preparedness work. And it actually allows a caseworker to basically talk to if a doctor said, look, I need to refer people, I've got 3 clients and I'm really concerned about them. That can be a follow-up, because I agree, I think that's hard to tack on to, a 15-minute or a 5-minute consultation with a client. But I think GPs and medical practices knowing that there might be somewhere that they could refer their more vulnerable clients to, and someone could actually have that conversation with them about how are you navigating your everyday life, who are you dependent on, and what would that look like in a disaster? Because that's very hard to organise at the last minute. People who might need to pick you up and take you out. And I guess we talk about this with the commander for Hawkesbury SES, with Kevin. It's like, you want those people who are the most vulnerable, where their evacuation would take the longest, you want those people to be leaving first, and you want them to be leaving when the first flag comes up. I mean, you don't want those people waiting till people are being ordered to evacuate. You ideally want those people saying, I'm going to relocate myself to my daughter's place or, my sister's place, and I'm going to move myself out of that risk and return when it's safe to do so. I think that's really where we'd ideally like the people who are the most vulnerable, and their moving or relocating is the most complex, you don't want those decisions being made within hours time. It's too hard. There's too many factors. And as Mim said, with patient X, if you think about all those resources that were needed in a small flood event, and you multiply by the numbers of people who might need that in a large event, there's numbers of people who will be left behind. And that's a situation that none of us want to happen.
Louise?
They're great points, and would be good to get those resources on the health pathways. Our pages are really just beginning. There's so much, so that peppercorn or whatever referral, we can put that on our preparing patients page, because it is, once you start talking to patients, suddenly you really are running late, because you're talking, there's so much to talk about. But I do think the elderly, the people on their own, and the young families are probably the highest needing of these plans, as well as everyone, but they're the ones we should do first. And at the moment it's floods. Another couple of years it'll be fire. People stay too long again in fire situations as well. And it'd be interesting to hear what you think, Hugh, about our future, but we are being told there's going to be more extreme weather events, both fire and floods, and we can't rely on the past to say that we were okay last time. You know, it's all really different this from here on in.
Yes.
And we've really got to be prepared. But anyway, I'd like, if you've got anything to add, Hugh, it'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've nailed it there, really, Louise. That is the signal for climate change in Australia, isn't it? That there's going to be more extreme events. We're seeing that currently with this extreme rainfall that we've seen through this season. And in the future, like you say, it's flooding now, but the way the climate goes in Australia, it flips. It flips from drought to flood to drought to flood, and there's years of average in between, but it changes. And in a couple of years' time, like you say, we could be looking at fires again. And that's the reality that we need to be prepared for. And that's the role that we're here for at the Bureau. We're here to provide that information. It's not just for the SES and the RFS, it's for primary healthcare trusts and anyone who's in the emergency space and needs to put emergency planning in place to try and get that message out to the people that are vulnerable to these events. And that's really why I'm so grateful that you've invited me along to this presentation, just to get that message out and that we can share that knowledge, and then everyone's working towards the same sort of plan.
I think the great thing about the person-centered plan is that, you know, it works off what the people are doing right now, their strengths, and then it just builds on top of what those gaps are to be able to combat any emergency. So it doesn't just focus on floods, it's fires, it's heat waves, it's what if your electricity goes out and you lose your food. So it's anything. So that's what's so nice about it, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, it is 8 o'clock, so I am going to wrap us up, but I want to thank all of our presenters tonight. What you have presented tonight has not only been extremely interesting, but is going to be very useful to all of us. So thank you very much for your time this evening, and also for your knowledge as well. I also would like to put another call of action out as well, and that is that if you are a general practice or you are a primary healthcare provider and you would like to speak to your general practice support team or to Mari about preparedness for your practice during a disaster, but also for other resources that you can use and have for your patients, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. If you are also interested in being a GP volunteer in a disaster situation as well, please also reach out to us as well. And as Louise said, Health Pathways is a critical resource. It is a resource that you can access on your phone as well. So if you're in a situation and you are not near your computer, you can access Health Pathways on your phone. It is a great resource, and it is constantly being updated. And as Louise was just talking about, we will also ensure that those other referral pathways that have been discussed tonight are included in that as well. So thank you to everyone for your time. If you can just scan the QR code and take a few minutes to complete our evaluation, we would really appreciate that. And Beck has also placed the link in the chat box. So if you can just click on that and complete that evaluation, that would be great. I wish you all a really good evening, and thank you again. Good night.